Picture this: you're sitting at your mother-in-law's dining table, surrounded by the warm glow of candles and the comfortable chatter of family, when suddenly your own history gets rewritten in real time. That's exactly where I was last Thanksgiving. Olivia Chin, 33 years old, marketing director, marathon runner, woman who prided herself on having her life together. When my husband looked me straight in the eye, smiled that charming smile everyone loves, and told everyone that I was remembering it wrong. Not misremembering. Not mistaken. Wrong. As if my memory was a defective product that needed his quality control, as if the past 5 years of our marriage existed in his version only, and mine was just faulty wiring in need of correction. Maybe you know this feeling too, that gut punch moment when someone rewrites your reality so smoothly that even you start to question what you know to be true. Sarah, my sister-in-law, was cutting into her pumpkin pie when it happened. My brother-in-law Tom was refilling wine glasses. My husband David, charming, successful David, who everyone thought was the perfect partner, was in the middle of telling a story about our anniversary trip, except none of it happened the way he was describing. Everything was so normal, so picture-perfect, until it wasn't. This is how gaslighting at family dinner works. It's quiet, it's public, and it uses witnesses to validate the lie. The toxic marriage story nobody wants to admit they're living unfolds right there between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce, and everyone just keeps chewing like nothing's happening. Hey race, what makes a controlling husband so effective? He doesn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. He just needs to be calm, reasonable, and utterly certain while telling you that your version of events never happened. David had perfected this over our 5 years together, and at 33, I'd spent nearly a sixth of my life learning to doubt myself in his presence. It's emotional manipulation marriage at its finest, using social pressure and your own self-doubt as weapons. The dark relationship drama playing out in my dining room wasn't about who remembered correctly, it was about who had the authority to decide what was real. And for years, I'd been handing him that authority on a silver platter, gift-wrapped with my silence and self-doubt. But something shifted that night. Instead of defending myself, explaining, or trying to prove my memory against his manufactured certainty, I did something that terrified me: absolutely nothing. This is the story of how my silence became the most powerful weapon in a silent revenge marriage I didn't even know I was fighting. It's about the emotional power reversal that happens when you stop playing a rigged game, and it's a female empowerment story that started with me, Olivia, the woman who always had the right answer in meetings but couldn't trust her own memory at home, learning that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to participate in your own erasure. What happened next changed everything, not just at that dinner table but in every room of my life. Thanksgiving at the Harrington house was always an event, the kind where David's mother, Patricia, spent 3 days preparing a feast that could feed a small army, and everyone dressed up like we were auditioning for a Norman Rockwell painting. I'd arrived that Thursday evening in November with a homemade pecan pie and my best smile, the one I'd perfected over 5 years of these gatherings. The family gathered around the table, Patricia at the head, David's father Robert carving the turkey with ceremonial precision, Sarah and Tom with their 2 kids who were miraculously well-behaved, and us. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the clinking of wine glasses, and I felt myself relax into the warmth of it all. This was what family was supposed to feel like, wasn't it? David had his arm draped casually across the back of my chair, playing the role of devoted husband with the ease of someone who'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. The protagonist expects respect and safety in moments like these, surrounded by people who've known you for years, who've watched your relationship grow, who presumably care about your well-being. I was 33 years old, successful in my career, articulate in every professional setting, yet somehow at this table I always felt like I was performing a version of myself that everyone else had approved. Still, it was comfortable. Familiar. The kind of comfortable that makes you ignore the small discomforts, like how David always ordered my wine for me or how he'd gently correct my stories when I told them. From the outside, our marriage appears stable, publicly more than stable actually. We were the couple other people envied. David, with his architectural firm and his easy charm, and me with my marketing director title and my put-together appearance. We didn't fight in public, didn't air our dirty laundry, didn't give anyone reason to worry. Patricia had told me just last month how lucky she felt that David had found someone so perfect for him, and I'd smiled and thanked her even as something small and sharp twisted in my chest. Because that's what you do when you're trying to convince everyone, including yourself, that everything's fine. So when the conversation turned to our anniversary trip to Napa Valley last spring, I let my emotional guard lowered completely. This was safe territory, happy memories, beautiful vineyards, that little bed and breakfast with the incredible sunset views. I reached for my water glass, feeling genuinely content for the first time in weeks, thinking maybe this Thanksgiving would be different. Maybe we could just be a normal family having a normal dinner, and I could forget about the growing unease that had been building in my gut for months. Sometimes the moments before everything changes are the quietest ones, the ones where you're not paying attention because you think you're finally safe. It started so innocuously I almost missed it. Sarah had asked about our anniversary trip, and I was in the middle of describing the wine tasting at that small family-owned vineyard when David laughed, not unkindly, but with that particular tone that made everyone else at the table lean in slightly, curious about what was coming. "Actually, honey," he said, his voice warm and indulgent, "that's not quite how it happened." The husband calmly challenges her memory, and I felt my stomach drop even before he continued. "We didn't do the wine tasting on Saturday. It was Friday afternoon, remember? Saturday we went hiking." I opened my mouth to correct him because I absolutely knew it had been Saturday, but he was already moving forward with his version. "You're remembering it wrong," he said with such casual certainty that for a split second I questioned myself. The phrase appears, "you're remembering it wrong," and suddenly the entire atmosphere at the table shifted in a way so subtle that if you weren't the target you might not even notice. David turned to his father with an easy smile. "Olivia's been so stressed with work lately, I think the days are all blending together for her." There it was, the gentle dismissal wrapped in concern, the suggestion that my memory was faulty not because he was lying, but because I was overwhelmed, overworked, not quite tracking reality correctly. Robert nodded sympathetically, and I watched my own experience get rewritten in real time. "No, David, I'm certain it was Saturday because I started," but he reached over and squeezed my hand, that same anchoring gesture that used to feel reassuring and now felt like a warning. "Sweetheart, I booked the reservation. I have the confirmation email if you want to see it." His tone was so reasonable, so patient, like he was gently guiding a confused child back to reality. Reality rewritten in front of others, and the worst part was how smoothly it happened, how naturally everyone at the table accepted his version without question. Sarah's expression shifted to mild concern for me, the woman who apparently couldn't remember her own anniversary weekend correctly. Tom suddenly became very interested in his green beans. The authority asserted publicly wasn't loud or aggressive, it was surgical in its precision. David launched into his version of the weekend, filling in details I knew were wrong. The restaurant where we had dinner Friday night, it was actually Thursday. The color of the sunset we watched from the balcony, golden and pink, not mostly orange like he claimed. Even the conversation Wed had over breakfast Sunday morning that he was now repositioning to Saturday. And with each detail, each confident assertion delivered with that trademark David charm, I felt myself becoming smaller at that table. This was gaslighting at family dinner in its purest form, using the audience, the social pressure, the desire not to make a scene, to cement his version of reality as the official record while mine evaporated like morning fog. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes from having your reality challenged in front of witnesses, a dizzying sensation where up becomes down and you start questioning whether you ever knew which way was which in the first place. I sat there at that Thanksgiving table, fork suspended halfway to my mouth, while the protagonist made to doubt herself in the most fundamental way possible. Had it been Friday? Was I really that confused about our own anniversary trip? I could see the vineyard so clearly in my mind, the Saturday afternoon sunlight slanting through the grapevines, the way the sommelier had made a joke about weekend crowds, but David's certainty was like gravity, pulling everyone's belief toward his orbit and away from mine. Patricia cleared her throat delicately, the way she did when things got uncomfortable, but she didn't intervene. None of them did. Others stay silent or uncomfortable, and that silence was its own form of complicity, a collective agreement that it was easier to let David's version stand than to wade into whatever dark relationship drama might be bubbling beneath our picture-perfect surface. Sarah caught my eye for half a second, and I thought I saw something there, recognition, maybe, or sympathy, but then she looked away and asked Tom to pass the rolls. The conversation was already moving on, lubricated by wine and the universal desire to avoid awkwardness, and I was left holding my incorrect memory like a grenade no one wanted to acknowledge. "It's okay, sweetheart," David said softly, leaning close enough that only I could hear the condescension wrapped in affection. "You've been working so hard lately. It's understandable that you're a little foggy on details." My feelings minimized with surgical precision, reduced to symptoms of stress and overwork rather than legitimate disagreement with his fabricated timeline. The toxic marriage story was writing itself in real time, and I was apparently the unreliable narrator of my own life. I wanted to scream, to pull out my phone and check my own photos with their timestamps, to demand that everyone at this table acknowledge that something deeply wrong was happening. But 33 years of socialization off being the good daughter-in-law, the non-dramatic wife, the woman who doesn't make scenes kept me frozen. So I did what was expected. I nodded. I smiled apologetically. I let David's hand remain on mine like a leash disguised as affection. Compliance expected and compliance delivered, because what was the alternative? Making a scene at Thanksgiving dinner? Insisting that my memory was correct and therefore calling my husband a liar in front of his entire family? The emotional manipulation marriage had trained me well. I knew the cost of pushing back, the exhausting cycle of argument and gaslighting that would follow, the way he'd later tell me I'd embarrassed him, embarrassed myself, that I was being paranoid or difficult or too sensitive. So I swallowed my certainty along with my turkey, and pretended that erasing myself was the same thing as keeping the peace. But hey, erase the thing about being told you're wrong about your own life one too many times. Eventually, something inside you just stops fighting. Not in defeat, exactly, but in a kind of crystalline clarity that comes from finally seeing the pattern for what it is. As David continued his revised history of our anniversary weekend, embellishing details that never happened while erasing ones that did, I felt something shift in my chest, not breaking, but settling. The protagonist chooses silence, not because she believed his version, but because she suddenly understood that arguing would only feed the machine. This wasn't about memory. This had never been about memory. I set my fork down carefully, deliberately, and when Patricia asked if everything was all right with the turkey, I smiled and said it was delicious. No defense or explanation, no attempt to re-argue my case or prove my version of events. I just let David's story hang in the air, complete and unchallenged, while I cut my turkey into precise, small pieces and chewed slowly. Sarah glanced at me again, her expression puzzled. She'd probably expected me to keep defending myself, to get flustered or upset the way I usually did when David corrected me. But I was done performing that particular dance. The controlling husband thrives on your reaction, feeds on the desperate energy you expend trying to convince everyone you're not crazy. What happens when you stop providing that fuel? The calm withdrawal wasn't strategic at first. It was more like emotional exhaustion finally winning over the need to be believed. I answered when spoken to, laughed at appropriate moments, helped clear dishes when dinner was done. But inside, I'd gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere David couldn't follow because he didn't even know it existed. It was the place where my memory lived, intact and unchanged by his revisionist history, the place where I still knew with absolute certainty that we'd gone wine tasting on Saturday afternoon and the sunset had been pink and golden, not orange. That place was mine, and for the first time in 5 years, I realized he couldn't actually touch it no matter how convincing his lies were. Attention subtly shifts when you stop fighting for it. David kept glancing at me throughout dessert, his expression gradually moving from satisfied to uncertain to something that looked almost like concern. Had won the argument, or rather, I'd stopped arguing, but somehow the victory seemed to make him uneasy. Tom started asking me about a marketing campaign I'd mentioned at the last family dinner, and I engaged enthusiastically, warmly, like nothing had happened at all. And maybe that was the most unsettling part for David. I wasn't hurt, wasn't angry, wasn't anything he could read or predict or manage. The emotional power reversal was already beginning, though nobody at that table, including me, fully understood it yet. I'd just stopped playing a game I could never win, and in that stopping, everything changed. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that feels like held breath. David kept glancing at me from the driver's seat, clearly waiting for something. An explosion, tears, the usual post-family dinner debrief where I'd tell him had hurt my feelings and had explained why I was being too sensitive. But I just watched the streetlights blur past, my hands folded in my lap, and said nothing. Recognition of a recurring gaslighting pattern was settling over me like snow, cold and clarifying and impossible to ignore now that I was finally paying attention. This wasn't the first time he'd rewritten our history in front of witnesses. It was just the first time I'd stopped fighting long enough to see the full shape of what he was doing. There was the time he'd told my parents we'd decided together to skip their anniversary party when I'd desperately wanted to go and had insisted we had prior commitments. The dinner party where he'd claimed I'd agreed to host when I'd explicitly said I was too overwhelmed with a work deadline. The couple's therapy session. The therapy session where he'd painted me as the forgetful, emotional one while the therapist nodded sympathetically at his patients. Understanding that arguing feeds control washed over me like ice water, shocking and wake-up call clear. Every time I'd defended my version, every time I'd pulled out evidence or insisted on my truth, I'd been handing him exactly what he needed: proof that I was unstable, combative, unable to accept reality. The emotional manipulation marriage had been using my own certainty against me. I thought about my friend Jessica, who'd escaped a similar dynamic 3 years ago and tried to warn me. The crazy thing, she'd said over coffee one afternoon, is that you start to believe you really are remembering things wrong. Like maybe you are the problem. I'd nodded politely but hadn't really heard her, because David wasn't like her ex-husband. David was charming, successful, loved by everyone. Except now I was sitting in his car, watching him grip the steering wheel with increasing tension, and I finally understood what Jessica had been trying to tell me. The decision to stop correcting the lie wasn't surrender, it was strategy, though I didn't fully know what kind yet. Emotional clarity replaces urgency when you stop trying to convince someone of a truth they're deliberately denying. I didn't need David to admit he was lying about our anniversary trip. I didn't need his family to believe me. I didn't need external validation of my own memory, my own experience, my own reality. What I needed was to stop giving him the power to make me doubt what I knew. The female empowerment story that was beginning to take shape in my mind wasn't about winning arguments or exposing his lies, it was about something quieter and more profound. It was about trusting myself again, even when everyone else was nodding along to his fiction. As we pulled into our driveway, David finally broke the silence. "Are you mad at me?" And I looked at him, really looked at him, and said simply, "No." Because I wasn't mad. I was done. And done, I was learning, was so much more powerful than angry. The thing about silence is that it's not actually passive, it's one of the most active choices you can make, especially when someone's expecting you to fill it with explanations, defenses, or apologies. Over the next few weeks, I practiced a new kind of disciplined silence maintained consistently whenever David tried to rewrite our reality. When he told his colleague at a holiday party that I'd been the one who wanted to move to the suburbs, I hadn't, I smiled and said nothing. When he informed our neighbors that I'd agreed we should get a dog next spring, news to me, I just sipped my wine and changed the subject. Each time felt like swallowing glass, but each time also felt like reclaiming a piece of myself had been eroding for 5 years. The silent revenge marriage I was quietly architecting wasn't about punishment, it was about withdrawal. Emotional engagement withdrawn, not with drama or declaration, but with the simple, devastating act of stopping participation. I stopped arguing about whose memory was correct. I stopped providing evidence or pulling up photos with timestamps or asking friends to corroborate my version of events. I stopped defending my reality because defending implies you're on trial, and I was done letting David be both prosecutor and judge. The toxic marriage story was still unfolding, but I was no longer reading from his script. I was writing my own in silence, one withheld reaction at a time. What fascinated me most was watching the power shifts through absence in real time. David, who'd always been so confident in his ability to shape narrative, started to falter when I stopped pushing back. It was like he needed my resistance to define himself against, needed my upset to prove his calm reasonableness. Without it, his corrections just hung in the air, strangely hollow. At his firm's Christmas party, he told a group of partners that we were planning to renovate the kitchen, something we'd never discussed, and I just stood there, pleasant and silent. One of the wives looked at me questioningly, and I simply smiled. No confirmation, no contradiction. Just silence. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than any argument I could have made. I started noticing how control weakens when you stop feeding it attention. The gaslighting at family dinner had worked because I'd fought it, because my visible distress had validated his narrative that I was confused, stressed, not tracking things correctly. But a woman who simply stops engaging? That's harder to diagnose, harder to manage, harder to control. David couldn't gaslight me into believing his version if I refused to discuss versions at all. He couldn't make me doubt my memory if I stopped treating my memory as something requiring his approval. The dark relationship drama was shifting, the protagonist finally understanding that the only way to win was to stop playing entirely. And in my silence, in my consistent, calm refusal to participate in my own erasure, I'd found a power I'd forgotten I possessed. Desperation looks different on everyone, but on David it manifested as escalation. By mid-December, Head started making increasingly outrageous claims, as if testing how far he could push before I'd finally crack and give him the reaction he was craving. Attempts to provoke a reaction became more frequent and more bizarre. He told his mother I'd decided to quit my job, I hadn't. Informed our financial advisor that we were planning to start trying for a baby immediately, absolutely not. Even claimed at a dinner party that I'd been the one who'd chosen our current apartment when he knew I'd hated it from day one. Each lie was bigger, bolder, more obviously false, and each time I just smiled serenely and said nothing at all. The most telling moment came during our weekly Sunday brunch with his parents, a tradition I'd grown to dread. David was recounting a story about our summer vacation, the one where we'd gone to Maine, and mid-story he paused, looked directly at me and said clearly, deliberately, or am I remembering it wrong, Olivia? Repeats the correction, but this time as a challenge, practically begging me to engage, to fight back, to give him something to work with. His father chuckled uncomfortably. Patricia studied her mimosa. And I just took a bite of my eggs Benedict, chewed thoughtfully, and said, the hollandaise is excellent today, Patricia. Did you use a different recipe? The confusion when silence holds was written all over David's face, a flicker of something that looked almost like panic. You could practically see the gears turning in his head, trying to understand this new version of me that wouldn't play the game according to his rules. Had built an entire system of control around my need to be believed, my desperate attempts to prove I wasn't crazy or forgetful or wrong. But a wife who simply opts out of the entire framework? That wasn't in his playbook. Over the next week, he tried everything: gentle concern, "Are you feeling okay? You've been so quiet lately," mild accusation, "You're being passive-aggressive and it's childish," even what I suspect was genuine confusion, "Did I do something wrong?" But I just maintained my pleasant, detached calm, like I was observing our marriage from a great distance rather than living in it. The most satisfying moment came at his firm's New Year's party, where Head gathered a small crowd to tell yet another revised history of our relationship. He was mid-sentence, explaining how I'd convinced him to propose after just 6 months of dating. It had been his idea, his timeline, his insistence. When he faltered, "Just stopped talking" mid-word, because I was standing right there with that same serene smile, saying nothing, and suddenly his authority erodes in real time. Without my protest to frame himself against, without my emotional response to justify his calm intervention, he was just a man telling stories that didn't quite land. Someone asked me if that was really how it happened, and I just laughed lightly and said, "David tells wonderful stories." Not yes, not no. Just silence wrapped in pleasantries. And in that moment, I watched him realize he was losing something he couldn't quite name but had always counted on: my complicity in my own diminishment. Hey, race, what nobody tells you about gaslighting: it only works if you keep showing up for the performance. The controlling husband needs you to argue, to defend, to provide evidence that he can then dismiss or reinterpret. He needs your emotional investment in being believed, because that investment is what gives him leverage. But silence can expose manipulation in ways that argument never can. When you stop fighting about whose version is correct, suddenly the person insisting on their version looks less like the voice of reason and more like someone desperately trying to control a narrative. The absence of your resistance reveals the shape of their control, like removing furniture from a room and finally seeing the walls for what they are. I learned that memory doesn't need approval, not David's, not his family's, not anyone's. I know what happened on our anniversary trip. I know when we went wine tasting, what color the sunset was, what we talked about over breakfast. My memory exists independent of David's acknowledgement, and that's a truth so fundamental I can't believe I ever let someone convince me otherwise. The female empowerment story here isn't about proving I was right or making him admit he was wrong. It's about recognizing that my reality doesn't require external validation to be real. I don't need to convince anyone of my truth for it to be true. That realization alone was worth every uncomfortable silence, every withheld explanation, every moment of biting my tongue until I tasted blood. What I discovered through this dark relationship drama was that gaslighting fails without resistance in the most literal sense. It's like trying to play tennis against someone who's put down their racket. You can keep serving the ball, but without someone hitting it back, the game just stops. David's whole system of control was built on my participation, on my need to correct the record, to be understood, to make him see reality the way I did. When I withdrew that participation, the entire structure collapsed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly and inevitably, like a building with its foundation removed. The emotional power reversal happened in the spaces where my voice used to be, in the silence where my protest used to live. And hey, race, the most important lesson: power returns quietly, not with fanfare or confrontation, but in the simple act of trusting yourself again. Every time I chose silence over defense, I was choosing my own knowing over his narrative. Every time I smiled and said nothing, I was refusing to trade my certainty for his approval. The toxic marriage story was ending, though David didn't know it yet. I was done being the woman who needed permission to trust her own memory, who required witnesses to validate her own experience, who apologized for knowing what she knew. The silent revenge marriage had taught me that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone trying to control you is simply to stop caring whether they believe you. Because once you stop needing them to acknowledge your reality, they've lost the only power they ever really had: your doubt. Hey, race, what nobody tells you about gaslighting: it only works if you keep showing up for the performance. The controlling husband needs you to argue, to defend, to provide evidence that he can then dismiss or reinterpret. He needs your emotional investment in being believed, because that investment is what gives him leverage. But silence can expose manipulation in ways that argument never can. When you stop fighting about whose version is correct, suddenly the person insisting on their version looks less like the voice of reason and more like someone desperately trying to control a narrative. The absence of your resistance reveals the shape of their control, like removing furniture from a room and finally seeing the walls for what they are. I learned that memory doesn't need approval, not David's, not his family's, not anyone's. I know what happened on our anniversary trip. I know when we went wine tasting, what color the sunset was, What we talked about over breakfast. My memory exists independent of David's acknowledgement, and that's a truth so fundamental I can't believe I ever let someone convince me otherwise. The female empowerment story here isn't about proving I was right or making him admit he was wrong. It's about recognizing that my reality doesn't require external validation to be real. I don't need to convince anyone of my truth for it to be true. That realization alone was worth every uncomfortable silence, every withheld explanation, every moment of biting my tongue until I tasted blood. What I discovered through this dark relationship drama was that gaslighting fails without resistance in the most literal sense. It's like trying to play tennis against someone who's put down their racket. You can keep serving the ball, but without someone hitting it back, the game just stops. David's whole system of control was built on my participation, on my need to correct the record, to be understood, to make him see reality the way I did. When I withdrew that participation, the entire structure collapsed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly and inevitably, like a building with its foundation removed. The emotional power reversal happened in the spaces where my voice used to be, in the silence where my protest used to live. And hey race, the most important lesson: power returns quietly, not with fanfare or confrontation, but in the simple act of trusting yourself again. Every time I chose silence over defense, I was choosing my own knowing over his narrative. Every time I smiled and said nothing, I was refusing to trade my certainty for his approval. The toxic marriage story was ending, though David didn't know it yet. I was done being the woman who needed permission to trust her own memory, who required witnesses to validate her own experience, who apologized for knowing what she knew. The silent revenge marriage had taught me that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone trying to control you is simply to stop caring whether they believe you. Because once you stop needing them to acknowledge your reality, they've lost the only power they ever really had: your doubt. So let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this question. How many times have you been told you're remembering something wrong? How many times have you second-guessed your own experience because someone else's certainty seemed more solid than yours? If you're keeping score, if the number is higher than 0 and climbing, you need to pay attention to what's happening. Because hey race, the uncomfortable truth about gaslighting at family dinner or anywhere else doesn't announce itself with villainous monologues. It shows up in calm corrections, gentle contradictions, and the subtle suggestion that your version of reality needs editing by someone who knows better. What are you going to do with this recognition? Are you going to keep defending your memory to people who have a vested interest in you doubting it, or are you going to start trusting yourself even when, especially when no one else does? The emotional manipulation marriage I lived through taught me that arguing with someone who's rewriting reality is like trying to win a game where they're making up the rules as you play. You can't win that game, but you can stop playing it. You can choose silence not as surrender but as strategy, not as weakness but as the most powerful form of resistance available to you. This isn't just my story, it's an invitation to examine your own. Look at the patterns. Notice who benefits when you doubt yourself. Pay attention to who gets uncomfortable when you trust your own knowing. The dark relationship drama doesn't have to be your permanent address. The controlling husband or partner or family member or friend who keeps telling you you're wrong about your own life, they only have as much power as you give them. And you can start taking that power back right now, today, with the revolutionary act of believing yourself. Not proving yourself to anyone else. Just quietly, firmly believing yourself. If this resonates, if you see yourself in Olivia's story, if you've ever sat at a table and watched your reality get rewritten while everyone else nodded along, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because you need to hear this more than once. You need to be reminded that you're not crazy, you're not too sensitive, you're not remembering it wrong. You're seeing clearly, maybe for the first time, and that clarity is threatening to people who've built their power on your confusion. Stay here. Keep listening. Keep trusting yourself. The female empowerment story you're writing starts the moment you stop letting other people hold the pen. And he'll be here, sharing more truths, telling more stories, reminding you that your silence can be your superpower and your memory belongs to you alone.